Hi, I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Age in Aviation magazine and AgeInAviation.com. Today we're in conversation with Deepak Sharma, the CEO of Air Finance Lease. We're going to talk about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the leasing industry. Deepak, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be talking to you.
We always address the elephant in the room first, COVID-19, its impact on aviation. Half the world's fleet or more is grounded. Production has slowed dramatically. Cargo's moving, which is probably the one bright spot of the whole industry. From a lessor's standpoint, can you give us sort of the big picture from where you're sitting on what's happening?
Well, I think there's one thing been common with the COVID-19 is that every business had to slam on the brakes. That's been the same for everyone, I think, except for the cargo, really. Nobody really knows when the business will be back to a pre-COVID level. When is that going to be? One of the interesting bit that I'm seeing from a leasing perspective is the financial institution seems to be making a alphabet soup out of the analysis, and some say it'll be V curve, some say it'll be U curve, and some say it's an L curve. So nobody really knows, and nobody's really certain. But I think from a leasing perspective and from an airline perspective, other than cargo, and even on a cargo side of things, I think what it has made everybody realize is that cash is really king. And if you don't have a cash right now, it's liquidity is what your life depends on for any business. I think that's what I'm seeing from a bigger picture perspective.
Now, I'm going to roll two questions into one here that we had talked about before. I've listened to more webinars than I care to admit about these days, and they all seem to happen at night, my time. But one participant said they'd never seen anything have as drastic an effect on aviation as COVID-19. But I want to add to that, there was also a poll recently about the biggest challenge to the leasing sector, and I think you touched on this just now. And things were pretty evenly split in the poll between airline failures and a lack of demand. But on the issue of failures, don't lessors really sort of take that into account when they underwrite the lease, and that's the time for the risk analysis? Or has COVID-19 just kind of thrown all that out the window?
Well, Matt, I would say that, unprecedented effect, I would agree. I find a couple of things interesting in the whole situation. I think we touched on it, saying it's had the same effect on everyone, regardless of what it is. But I think the path for coming out of this seems different and depends on region and available liquidity and a business model and government support. If I may just elaborate on that slightly, we are hearing more about Australia and New Zealand opening up more regionally first before anybody else. And obviously, business model wise, if your business model is a holiday business model, the likes of holiday airline, it's going to be heavily impacted because holiday is not something people are really thinking right now because of the situation. Moving on to the second part of the question, it has changed. The COVID-19 has changed everything in significant way. I mean, let's just quick look at the history, and if my figures are correct, I think the first major airline was set up in 1919 in the world. The first major lease deal was done in 1970s, and that was only 2% of the global fleet at that point. 1980s saw somewhere around 15% lease activity, and in the 90s and 2000, the lease activity grew to a level that we are seeing now. Now, in this time, since the start of the airline era and through the lease time, frankly, the pandemic has not been in the forefront of the underwriter's mind to put it on the lease and to do a risk analysis. Obviously, this will be something that I'm pretty sure the underwriters will look at it and the risk analysis will be done. But this has been something unimaginable, to be honest with you, in the recent days. So, frankly, it's not underwritten, and that's a challenge by itself. Which is why, there isn't a real protection to anyone in this situation. It's just one.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to that in a little bit because those are excellent points. I mean, obviously, this is a health crisis first and foremost. It's not really an aviation crisis, although the industry is in survival mode. But it's a health crisis, and the governments are the ones that shut down the borders, impose the quarantines, which forced a stop to all the traffic. Do you see governments playing a bigger role in aviation and in leasing? Do you see organizations like ICAO? I mean, IATA's been making a lot of noise. ICAO seems to have been a little bit slow in stepping up to the plate. But where do you see the governments playing a role in this?
Well, I think let's look at this from two points of view. One from the leasing side and one from the government side. I think it's a very delicate balance from a government perspective because, let's face it, without people there is no economy. And I think that's what the government's looking at right now. If you can't save your people, you don't have an economy. You don't have businesses tomorrow. So there is that emphasis from the government side. Now, the economy and the businesses all depend on health of the people, number one. Then the economy and everything else depends on how the businesses grow going forward. So all of that is critical for this to come back into the pre-COVID level when this is all settles down. But from a government perspective, right now, what government is really focusing on is locking down rather than the revival of the business. I mean, it's thought of slowly, but right now I think the government is more thinking about, okay, how do we contain it versus, how is the airlines going to survive? Their thought process really is around keeping people's home safe, a mortgage paid, and so on and so forth, and keeping the payroll. I mean, we've seen trillions of dollars of bailouts and things happening, but they are going towards people's payroll rather than keeping the airline flying. That's not in the forefront. But at some point, the government will have to do more than just policy writing and say, well, this is what we're going to do, or this is what we suggest. It'll have to be more than that and say, well, this is how we're going to prepare an infrastructure that supports our public, our aviation, the leasing community, and so on and so forth. Frankly, I think right now, from what we see, other than supporting people, jobs, payroll, everything else has been a secondary issue for the governments around the world.
Let's talk about leasing, since this show is all about leasing and you're in the leasing business. How has Air Finance Lease been adapting in terms of working from home? You said you've been at home for 8 weeks. And also from a business perspective, and again, from the webinars I've been listening to and the other leasing companies that are involved, are your customers talking about deferrals, other kinds of relief? Do you see opportunities in the sale-leaseback sector? Kind of give us the 50-cent tour there.
Yeah, I would say that, without the current technology, it would have been extremely difficult to do what we're doing even from home. I think the technology makes it so much more easier. I'm in London and you're in Singapore, and here we are talking to each other. I mean, this is, business can still carry on if there is a business to be done. But I think we are no exception to the rule from a business perspective. Our customers, our lessees are asking for deferrals. There is a increased activity on a sale and leaseback, request. But the key around all of this is you have to look at a long-term sustainability. And right now, frankly, nobody really knows which airlines, who is going to be there. So, if you've got aircraft on lease, yes, you've got to accommodate the request. You've got to work with the airlines, but sale and leaseback is still, quite a big decision making, and you've got to look at sustainability, and that's still quite further away from looking at it and saying whether you can actually, the airlines will be able to make it through, and while you invest, borrowed cash into it.
Well, everybody's waiting for the quote new normal to arrive, and nobody knows what that's going to be. Let me ask you this. In the recent years, and I've been editor of the magazine for about 5 years now, and I used to think leasing was a black hole, a black box, and it was a magical art. And then I started to learn more about it, and I thought, okay, I think I understand it now a little bit more. But I've seen people, there's been a lot more banks, there's been a lot more funds come into the business. Do you see the I don't want to say non-traditional, but sort of the newer players that came into the market when the returns were really good, and they said, hey, that's a great market to be in. We're going to take a piece of BOC Aviation. We're going to take a piece of your company or something like that. Do you see them staying with the business, or are they looking at the fact that a lot of these airlines may not make it through the next 6 months? Do you see them sort of cutting their losses and running?
Well, I think with every major event around the world, and I think we've seen this, whether it's the 2008, whether it's a 9/11, whether it's any previous event, some level of consolidation is bound to happen. The reason for that is, we most of the leasing companies and financial houses were dealing with what I call a cheap money up to recent days, and I think that cheap money may not simply be available and may not be sustainable for two reasons. Aviation, lease or sale or anything trade is a supply and demand market, and we are yet to know what is the surplus to requirement is going to be in the market, and cheap money may not just bail you out. So I think consolidation will happen. The returns that were planned initially were probably good enough at that point of time, but now that's going to significantly change.
Airline, I mean, we'll stick with the money because that's everybody, that's where the interest is. Follow the money. Airlines and OEMs like Boeing raised $25 billion in the debt markets the other day. Singapore Airlines has raised, I think, something like 15 billion Singapore dollars. They seem to have hit the debt markets or tapped other sources of financing a bit quicker than lessors, although I may not be correct in that. Would you agree with that? And are lessors hitting the markets as well, or is everybody got enough liquidity to handle things?
It happened in two phases. I think the airlines and OEM realized the cash crunch that was coming at a very early stage. Number one, I would say airlines looked at it because the drop or refund requests of the tickets, and recent IATA reports have shown how big that refund is likely to be. And if those refunds happen, the airlines, will not survive, majority of them, and it's a pretty disastrous figures. So airlines looked at it, and I think they went out on the debt market or seeked bailout at the very early stage, while lessors was a slightly delayed scenario, because lessors were looking and saying, okay, how bad this is going to be? Is this going to be regional? Is this going to be one particular area, or is it going? Nobody really knew this was going to become a global problem and everybody's going to be affected. So now I think, as you would see from news yesterday and day before and last week, there are a lot of lessors and leasing houses that are going out there, tapping into revolving facilities, tapping into various debt facilities, and I think it's also driven by the fact that some might be thinking about the growth in this time, and it's easier to grow and what have you, but some also looking at the fact that they are going to need a liquidity, if airlines are not going to pay. So that I think it's a delayed phase, but it's definitely happening.
How tough is it to raise? I mean, if you're a lessor, how tough is it to raise money, or bond buyers driving harder bargains?
Well, I think it all depends on how decent your balance sheet is and how decent your guarantees and credit looks right now. Now, if you've been dealing in a cheap money and a very low return, and your balance sheet wasn't as strong as you thought, I think it's still very difficult. I mean, everybody's looking at B ratings and A ratings, and all of that matters at the end of the day. Right now, still, people are borrowing from anything between, a good organization will borrow anything between 3% to 6%, and bad debt borrowing is much higher than that. But aviation is probably not the one that people are really interested in investing right now, and that poses another tough situation. So we have seen, like you said, the likes of the Singapore Airlines and others have got a pretty huge amount because they are government backed, and but not many leasing companies are government backed. So
No.
that poses a bigger challenge. That poses a bigger challenge.
Although one of your competitors who recently tapped a revolving credit facility, I think they're backed by maybe backed by a state bank who's got a significant chunk of action. And they said that they were actually tapping one of their credit facilities to go out and buy aircraft. Are you going to be, is now the time to buy? I mean, Boeing and Airbus, they slowed production. And we know that prices are going to go way down. And people are talking about entire airframe, certain airframes are going to just be thrown out in favor of newer airframes, more fuel efficient, the new generation aircraft. Is this a time that you're looking at possibly expanding your portfolio?
I think I will say we are optimistically cautious about how what we want. We are looking at new ventures, acquiring more assets into the portfolio, absolutely. But I think I answered this question in another way early on, where I mentioned about supply and demand. Now, yes, it's okay at this stage to go out and say we're going to buy, but what are you buying at? What is the cost? Because we've seen reports from financial institution like JP Morgan Chase recently, where the asset values are decreasing from anywhere between 29 to 40%. And then that analysis was done at the early days. Now, as there are more assets becomes available, if you want to go and acquire more, but if there is a surplus to requirement, what are we going to achieve? Because at the end of the day, the asset has to generate some amount of return, and if there is a surplus in the market, with this sort of time, everybody's going to go for the lowest cost possible base. It sounds great from PR perspective to grow your portfolio, but I think the total effect is yet to be seen, and I think we will realize the true extent of what would happen in the next 3 to 4 months. That's what I would say.
Well, actually, I need to plug the magazine here because we've got a story coming out on narrow body and regional jets and what those values are going to be. So look for that when the next issue of Asian Aviation magazine comes out. Sorry, I had to do a shameless plug there for that story because I just edited that story today and moved it on. But let me ask you a question because you bring up some interesting points. There's got to be, for you and for the airports to make money and the airlines to make money and all of that, people got to fly. And IATA had their media call last night, and they're talking about a pre-COVID-19 return numbers won't be here till 2023 or something like that. So, and everybody is talking about, again, the quote, new normal, being a much smaller industry, fewer routes, narrow body planes for the most part, some wide body. I mean, the international service will come back when the countries open their borders. Is that how you kind of see things happening?
Indeed, I think the big question in everybody's mind, and I think you hit the nail on the head there, is the load factor. What is the load factor going to be? We heard from Ryanair 40% of the fleet coming back and 60% of the fleet coming back, and every airline has a different view of what percentage of the aircraft will be back on flying, but at what load factor? I mean, most of these businesses, in the good days, the load factor, break-even load factor were in the 70s, right? Or some airlines were in the mid-80s. If we look at it today, to fill 80-85% of the aircraft in this current situation, it's going to be pretty tough. And I think yes, it is going to take some time for the load factor to return. And if the load factors don't return until the load factors don't return to a level that is sustainable for business, you can't really say how many percent of the aircraft's going out there, because all you're doing is turning into a cash burning machine. And then you go back to same situation of what do you do with that liquidity, because you are burning cash. I mean, airplanes are not cheap to just fly out there for fun.
No, not at all. And one of my favorite quotes, and I repeat this probably too much, though, is, I was at a conference when we still had in-person physical conferences, and I remember one speaker talking about the margins on flights, and he said, every airline is a hamburger and a Coke away from losing money on that passenger for that flight, because the margins were anywhere from $3 to $17 per passenger per flight. And I thought that was a great line. You're a hamburger and a Coke away from losing money.
Well, I mean, what I know, without mentioning the name of the airline, is that some of the low-fare airline in Europe, I'm talking about pretty large airlines, were operating at 60 cents profit margin a seat.
That's amazing.
Right, and now we're talking about, okay, well, the load factor is going to be down 50%. Well, hang on, well, then why would you fly it? Number one. Number two is, you had customers, screaming around, oh, they don't even give you a tea. Well, if they give you a tea, they lost their profit margin on it, right? So that's, I think we pushed this business very far. The aviation business went really, really far. Airlines were, cramming passengers in. It was like a tin of sardine in the airplane, and the more bums on the seat, the more money you made. What this situation does is changes that you can't just fill the aircraft with more people. We don't even know, and I think we are going back to our earlier question about what is the government going to do. If they're going to roll out a policy sheet that says, your 29 seat pitch is not good enough anymore, and you have to have this amount of distance. Well, your whole break-even load factors change, your whole layouts change. Okay, the aircraft will be able to fly for longer, but at what price to the customer? And would the customer passenger pay that price? So this is going to be new normal when we know. And I think right now, still quite unclear to me of how this is all going to look, because the policymakers are still busy. We are in the mid of the crisis right now, even though we think that we're coming out. I think we're still in the mid, but the dust hasn't settled. And then I think once a policymaker really get a grips with it and start building policies around it, it will become a lot clearer.
I'm very curious because, and again, it's another thing that came up in one of these bloody webinars that we've all been watching, but there was a very knowledgeable gentleman. He's been in the industry for 40, 50 years, and he actually made, I don't know how, I think it was serious. It may have been a bit of hyperbole, but he actually said that if you go back to the time from when the Wright brothers flew their first airplane to today, right, that the aviation industry is actually, or the airline industry has actually never been profitable. And he said, I don't understand why people want to be in the airline business. Because, and he said, if you look at the history, he said, on a net basis, it's been unprofitable. Is that anywhere near the truth?
I think we've seen more profitability in the recent days pre-COVID than I think I remember one particularly senior person within a very large airline organization during one of the AIDA conference said, in the 70s and 80s they were losing money, the oil prices were down, and now the oil prices were up, and now the oil price is up, but they're making money. And I think if we look at a net basis for last 100 years, yes, that may be true. But if we really look at it and say, but markets don't run on 100-year basis philosophy. Markets run on quarterly philosophy nowadays. Let's say it's a quarter by quarter thing almost. But if we really look at last few years and post 9/11 and when the business picked up, I would say that we look at a lot of the U.S. airlines, we look at a lot of the European airlines, they have posted a significant amount of profits. The question really became, what they did with it, whether they invested on it or they paid dividends on it. That's a different subject. But airlines did make money, and it's a very tough business, right? Because the bigger fish out there are still the strongest, and you can't have a price war. Everybody tries to find a niche of a sort to make money. But it's definitely not a business for a lighthearted, for definite. And right now we're seeing unprecedented level of amounts out there. I think I saw something around 63 billion is the total amount required in the aviation industry, and 43 of that is the tickets amount. If that was refunded, there's a lot of uncertainty around it. So let's see what happens next. But it's not the most profitable business most of the time. But when it is, yes, it does pay.
Let's move on to a couple of things. We talked earlier about newer aircraft versus older aircraft being retired, things like that. Airbus has said they're slowing production. Boeing, of course, is slowing production. They're still hobbled by the grounding of the MAX. Then there's no telling when that's going to get back in the air. There were some polls done earlier, and from what I read, most of the polls seem to think that there would be deliveries this year of commercial aircraft of between 600 units to about 1,000 units, and which obviously is low compared to the past years. I remember the first Singapore Air Show I went to, everybody and their dog was jumping over themselves to try to announce the latest, $50 billion plane order and all of that. That went away quickly. But also people said, look, there are huge supply chain issues out there. You've got a lot of lost jobs. A lot of technicians have been laid off. Some factories have been affected because you had infections there, so they had to close down. They had to super clean the place. Do you think deliveries, do you think 600 this year is about the right number? You think 1,000 is the right number, or somewhere in between?
Well, I would look at it in a way that, well, we know manufacturers and MROs have had it really tough. But if we look at deliveries, I would say the delivery were up to normal stage for January and Feb. And then March is when it starts hitting the ground, right? It's really ground to a halt. And if we really look at it today and say, okay, well, we're talking about some production starting, but airlines don't really have the money. They're still trying to preserve the cash, still trying to delay deliveries, and we heard all sort of things. So I look at it and say, okay, we are in mid-May. That probably means that the summer season in Europe and winter season in Southern Hemisphere, or depending on where the busy season is and where most of the deliveries are going, which we both know most of the deliveries were still planning to be Asia and some to North America. I think that the delivery for it to come back to anywhere between normal stage is going to be September, October at the best. So we're really talking about 4 months of normal delivery in 12. And if I look at that, I would say we would have done very well if we crossed the 600 milestone. Mm. Okay. That's the way I look at it. I don't think airlines will run to take delivery anywhere before September, even if things were good, because of the capacity and the load factors we talked about earlier, and preservation of cash being the most important thing. So I look at it and go, well, October, November, December, Jan, Feb, okay, 5 months of delivery, and what is that normal number is going to look like? And I think if we cross 600, that's done very well. MROs and supply chain, it's a huge issue. We know that a lot of MROs are not inducting or have postponed inducting any assets, engines or aircraft for reasons of technician not being available, or they can't get the parts on time. So that's another issue. Not forgetting the maintenance season in the Northern Hemisphere is going to start around October anyway. So if the load factors are there by then I think airlines will. But if the load factors are low, then the aircraft are going to remain parked. So is yet to be seen, which is why I said I think it's quite unclear. We will have to see what level of load gets back and what the government policies will be.
Still in deliveries a little bit. I mean, LCCs have been really driving the narrow body market, especially here. You can't talk about that without talking about AirAsia, for example. But other, low cost carriers have really been driving the narrow body market. Where do you kind of see them on deliveries, and do they have the liquidity to take planes if and when business opens up again? And again, I know nobody knows when the traffic's going to come back and all of that. So,
well, it's a very interesting time because yesterday there was I'm sure you read the news, and I did certainly, and it's in the public domain, so there's no issue discussing it. I saw a news about Stelios Hadjigayanu from EasyJet putting a $5 million price mark on somebody who can tell him how to get out of deliveries and delay deliveries or cancel orders with Airbus.
Yeah, I saw that.
You saw that. And we've seen similar sort of thing with some of the large low-cost carriers from Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia, where recent aircraft orders have been put up for sale by the manufacturer. So that's happening. I think majority of LCCs are still trying to preserve the cash or generate the cash through the asset sell and lease back or asset sell right now. And I think it would be very premature, and I don't think anybody will rush for more deliveries until the whole load factor and the government policy becomes clear to them. I think I'm repeating myself again from what I said before. I don't think LCCs, from what we have seen, I mean, we've seen major airlines, even spending money trying to cancel orders or defer orders. So I think deliveries are going to be quite difficult for them until the situation returns to normal. Nobody's going to pay money to manufacturers when the question of survival is the first question.
I'm going to compress a couple of questions because the more I read them, the more they flow together a little bit. Very quickly, airline-owned leasing companies, again, another one of these webinars. Some of them have been going away, but that seemed to be a process that a lot of the airlines were already started in that direction of sort of hiving off that asset and concentrating on the core business of moving people. Do you see airline-owned leasing companies going away, or are a few going to stick around?
I think few will stick around for following reasons. I think I don't think the model is obsolete, but I think what they have as a benefit is airline-owned leasing companies will probably have one benefit, that they may be able to distribute the assets in a way that suits their need without having to just request for payment holidays through outside leasing companies and so on and so forth. So I think the structure will, if the structure allows it, I think there is still a good chance for them for survival. I don't think it's something that's just going to simply go away unless it was one of those just created just to do one or two aircraft. But I think large structures like that will survive.
Another quick question. Dedicated freighter market. Is that something that you guys are involved in very much?
We deal with the freighter market day in, day out, and right now it's a booming market. I would say it's probably a booming market for next 3 to 6 months. It's in that bubble right now. As the passenger aircraft starts flying and some cargoes are carried in the belly, I think that the dedicated freight market will see a decline. But obviously, right now it's on the boom. It's growing, and whether after 3 to 6 months whether it remains like that is still questionable. Because if we look at global cargo market, previous years was in the decline, and it wasn't that great. So this is one of the silver lining in the cloud that we've had on a COVID cloud that freighter markets have picked up, but that's still it's a temporary boom.
Yeah, cargo markets for the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, it was just a steady, downward number. It was terrible. Let's talk about, we talked about the root of all evil, money, earlier, and but now also there's a process that happens when somebody defaults on a lease, or when you transition an aircraft. Right now, it's come to the end of the lease. You're trying to get an inspection done. You're trying to get signatures from the appropriate authorities. Everybody's locked down. The borders are closed. If you do manage to get someone over there, they're in quarantine for 2 weeks, maybe in a nice hotel, maybe not in a nice hotel. How hard is the transition process when you're either trying to, repossess an asset if you have to because somebody went Chapter 11, or, I think in the UK it's administration. I used to cover bankruptcy court back in the States, so I'm very familiar with Chapter 11, Chapter 7, Chapter 13, and all of that. But can you get people in there to do the checks? There was one lessor who was saying in a webinar again, he said we try to get local, if we can't get people in there, or if they're going to be quarantined for 2 weeks, we try to get some local staff, but there may not be the technology, and the shop may be shut down if you have to do an inspection, and the lawyer that needs to countersign something may be gone. I mean, how is the process for you guys working right now?
Well, it's probably one of the most major challenges we've faced. One is trying to get people there to review the aircraft or the asset, or to move assets around, engines, and anything like that. It's extremely difficult. There are local solutions available depending on where it is, but that comes at quite a premium price right now because people realize that it is not easy to move people around. So it becomes quite expensive. One of the example was we're trying to move an engine, and in pre-COVID days, that engine would have moved within 3 days from Middle East to Europe. Now you're looking at well, first of all, when you're going to get a slot, how air freight is becoming ridiculously expensive. So it's probably 30 days away, and it's going to cost you 5 times as much. That's another issue, and trying to get a right technical people to do things, from our organization to go and visit the aircraft or look at the records, it's extremely challenging. So that has been a major challenge. And repossession in this current stage is not possible. I mean, we've seen a lot of lessors, especially the airlines that have gone into administration. The lessors seem to be still screaming and saying, well, we need the asset back, but who's going to go and get the asset back? There isn't, and it's really difficult right now on that.
Let me jump in there because that's interesting. When an airline, you get Virgin Australia is in administration right now, and if I remember my American bankruptcy law correctly, and I should because my mom was a lawyer and my eldest brother was a lawyer, but the bondholders are sort of the senior secured creditors and so on and so forth. Where do the lessors stand in the ranks of creditors when an airline that has several of your engines or several of your planes, where do you stand in terms of seniority of the creditors?
I think you may correct me on this because you know this much better. I think the first line becomes anything that's due to the government, right? I mean, that's the first thing, okay? So if you owe on taxes, you owe on anything on the government, that becomes number one. Number two is the senior, creditors, like you said. And I think lessors are number three in reality, almost like number three in that, because you've got the government-owned amount, then you have the creditors, and then you have the lessors within that creditor portfolio if they have the asset out there. But then I think then you have the other creditors or other suppliers that fall into other categories at the bottom. But I think it's still within number three. I think the lessors are still within number three.
Yeah, the debt holders are number two. I mean, they that's what you really want to follow. Whoever owns the debt, which was very interesting in a movie called The International. I don't know if you're a film buff, but it was a very good movie. And there was a banker in there, and he said, "Look, it's all about owning the debt." Yeah. He said,
I haven't watched it, but I will.
You should. And sticking with this kind of topic, though, let me ask you a question. How exposed are leasing companies to things like material adverse effect clauses, the force majeure things? Are you really exposed in something like this? I doubt pandemics were actually written into the lease before. I'm sure they will be from now on. But how are you affected by those kinds of clauses?
Well, I think Matt, from you know this as well as I do. I think for anybody to go and claim a material adverse effect right now, I think it's going to be pretty difficult, because who's going to set the precedence? Because once you set that precedence, every other airline is going to follow that, right? So number one, that's going to be the challenge of somebody's going to have to set the precedence to do it. And I don't know which legal court will ever want to deal with this right now, especially the fact that pandemic, unless somebody had a real vision, I don't think it's in probably the 99% of the contracts. It's similarly. We got to look at it in the way that the act of war and all of that came in after the post-Gulf War, and act of terrorism was added. Various things gets added. Of course, now moving forward, contracts will probably have a pandemic and definition of pandemic, and what WHO says, and all that sort of thing will happen. But right now, I don't think any legal jurisdiction will be able to rule on the fact that this will fall under a material adverse effect, because if they do, that will set a precedent for every airline in the world, and that's what they're going to start claiming. And it's gonna be a legal overload, and unfortunately, I think this could go up to a pretty high level if that happened. I don't think that's foreseeable right now.
Have you been adding? Do you have an in-house counsel? Have you been building up his team lately? Are you hiring?
We're definitely adding things into it and revising it on daily basis, I would say.
Well, I hope you have good solicitors there in London.
Yeah, no, indeed. They're costly, but they're good.
Well, they always do. They always do cost. Deepak, finally, I try to always end these shows. We're talking about a very serious subject. It's a global pandemic that's killed hundreds of thousands of people. Millions of people who've lost their jobs. We don't want to downplay the seriousness of this. People are talking recession, possible depression, and so I know it might seem funny to end it this way, but is there a bright spot particularly in the leasing business, or perhaps overall? Are there some opportunities in the chaos that you see?
Well, I think there's always opportunity in every chaos. But, we talked a little bit about the SLB opportunities, and there are, pretty serious and good credit companies that are out there. Asset availability is definitely one thing. There are a lot of lucrative assets that are becoming available. There has been a boom in the freighter market, and leasing of freighter aircraft is definitely there. But nevertheless, I think yes, there are temporary and short booms that we are seeing, and like you said, we don't want to downplay the whole thing. It's a major event in the world, and the UK said yesterday the GDP is contracted by 2%. So yes, it's a pretty serious situation, but there are some good opportunities out there, like we said, and good options there to deploy your capital if the company chooses to do so.
Deepak Sharma, CEO of Air Finance Lease, thanks for your time today and stay safe.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Good to see you. Good to talk to you. Cheers.